If we're going to be working in abstract art, before we even get into producing it with filters or how those filters work, we need to talk a little bit about principles of design. How do we make things feel balanced so that people are comfortable looking at it? And how do we create a sense of motion so that people will have places to look and maybe an order that they'll look at them in so that we could perhaps guide them throughout an image? Well, both balance and motion, or movement, depending on who you ask, can be created by following rules of design, which is especially useful for us because we're going to be working in an abstract way. What else are we going to follow other than structure we've built ourselves? We can build that structure with rules, and you'll seem straightforward enough, especially if you've had color and design already, which is a great class. But even if it's been a while, or even if you haven't had it, you may want to Google rules of design. Principles of design is another way to look at that. But immediately you'll notice a problem. Here we have the 10 rules of composition all designers live by. Or maybe it's the 20 rules of design you should never break instead of the 10 rules. Well, what about the 7 principles of design? Or was it 12 or 6? Maybe there are 9? Maybe it's 20 again, or 10 or 15 or 5. Why are there so many different numbers of rules? If we're trying to build a structure, there should just be some structured rules, right? Well, it has to do with this. These are different approaches to producing a result. Think of it this way. If you were making food and you had salt, flour, eggs, maybe vanilla, chocolate chips, baking powder, baking soda, basic pieces, maybe you could start making different things out of it, like cake or cookies or muffins. Now I'm a little hungry, and maybe you are too, but those aren't really the same thing. Just by following different amounts and mixtures of things, you can produce very different things, but they're all edible. So in the same way that you are making something edible using different components, we're making different artwork following different pieces. But these pieces, these rules, these principles may have overlap. We may not need all of them all the time. We may need some of them some of the time, or even all of the time if we really like them. But why do we need any of them? We're building structure, right? Shouldn't there just be something that's core to everything that we just follow? Well, not quite. As it turns out, with today's technology, it's easier than ever to figure out what people are looking at. You can produce things called motion tracking maps or heat maps that will show you what people were looking at by placing a camera facing a viewer and then have that viewer look at pictures and artwork. So, for example, where are the places that people are going to look? Well, you can do motion tracking and see that they bounce around within certain areas of pieces. And this came from a +1 article, When Art Moves the Eye, Behavioral and Eye Tracking Studies. It's a very long read if anyone's interested in doing it. I think for our purposes, just the map of what people are looking at is useful enough. So we have all of this, right? All of this image, but for some reason, people are looking at very specific things. You can backwards engineer this, and when you do that, and backwards engineering just means deconstruct it down to its base parts that all kind of work together in this case. I don't mean actually disassembling something. You can backwards engineer it and start coming up with principles. However, looking at different types of images will result in different principles, different rules of what's going on, which starts to bring us back to the idea of baking different things using the same components, right? It all has flour in it if it's a cookie or cake or what have you. I mean, you could probably get away not using flour, maybe cauliflower or something if you're clever about it. But if you started with a pastry and then disassembled it down to the main components, you'd start to realize that the process you used to get to it is different every time, even though it has the initial pieces. So let's look at one more thing while I let you digest on that. Here are some heat maps on some actors. Now, what is a heat map? Well, if we had these motion maps where people's eyes bounced around in certain areas, either the longer that they looked at a specific area, or the more often that they looked at an area, which would result in more blobs, you could change that color. So if they only looked at it a little bit, you could make it green, for example. If they looked at it a lot, you can make it red. And then you end up with something like this. You can see from the cool areas, they're they're not looked at that much, and then the hot areas are looked at a lot. So you can see in these two examples, for some reason, people are looking in this area. Now, more interestingly, they're not looking at identical sections. What do I mean by that? We seem to be focusing on an eye, right? Why aren't we focusing on both eyes? Well, there's something called the facial triangle, and that's what a person uses to identify a human being. It's why old superhero comics had them wearing masks, to break that up and make it harder to identify them. So you need to, as a human, look kind of in this area, the nose, the eyes, eyebrows, all that, to identify a person. But for some reason, they're pushing it to just one side. Why not both? Well, in this case, I believe it has something to do with the golden ratio. We'll talk about that in a bit. It's how the eyes move. And in this case, it has to do with the fact that in America, at least, we read from left to right, which means that we've been trained to look at images from left to right. Now, that's not true in all places, all countries, all societies. So for this, we're just going to be focusing kind of on a Western structure. In other words, we'll think of it left to right rather than necessarily bottom right corner up to the top left corner. In fact, because we've been trained to read this way, we have a tendency to look at things from left to right, top to bottom, which is already a principle of design. So if you look left to right, top to bottom, if you placed some objects at the top left, people are most likely to look at that first. In the bottom right, they're likely to look at that last. Well, how do we know that for sure? More heat maps. Check this out. You'll notice that things tend to start in the top left, and then they bounce around to the bottom right. And in fact, if you have things of interest, such as this model, you may never get to the bottom right. We hit some text and stuff. We're not coming all the way down here. This blends in. This was the product. And so this is an issue. If your point was to buy 303 and everyone's looking, at this lady instead of the 303 bottle, you failed as an advertiser, right? Now over here, flat out, top left, while we hit this, there's something else with text coming in, so we slide right down, and then we focus on that for quite a while. And then there's also some stuff over here, so we start looking at that. But it's hard to get away. So there's some more at play, but we're still following left, top left, bottom right. They never make it to the bottom right in this case, because there's stuff to look at up here. They may never even notice this, even though this has contrast to it, which is one of the principles of design we'll talk about. Right, so there are even more. There are psychological things such as what types of people do people tend to look at, that sort of thing. But we're not going to get into too much of that this time around. So in other words, what we're trying to figure out is, what do people look at normally in what order? And then once we know what they're doing, like, oh, they're going to look at eyes, but they're going to look left to right, they're going to look top to bottom, we start getting those rules. We're essentially disassembling something to get to it. Oh, that's a lot, right? So let's actually get into some of those rules of design instead of just talking about why they exist. And maybe we can get to the bottom of some very, very useful ones. All right, I will see you in the next video when we actually get into this. See you in a second.